Our planet's bygone past has been a source of enigma and fascination for generations upon generations. And there is perhaps nothing that embodies the allure of Earth's deep history more than a dinosaur. From renowned naturalists to children barely learning how to talk, humans have been transfixed by the monumental skeletons of these magnificent beasts for time immemorial. Not the most magical and fantastical of tales, written by some of the greatest minds ever to lay pen upon paper, have managed to capture our imaginations more than the ancient legacy of the dinosaurs. Animals that seem so utterly beyond our comprehension, yet walked the very same earth that we now stand upon. It's safe to say that at some point in our childhoods, nearly all of us went through a dinosaur phase. A time when every waking moment seemed to revolve around them, when dinosaur figurines would adorn every shelf, and school lunch hours, at least when we weren't playing foursquare handball, were spent chasing one another around, roaring, stomping, and all the while holding our arms in a classic T-Rex pose. I myself entered my dinosaur phase a little later than most. At a time when most of my peers seemed to live and breathe dinosaurs, I couldn't have cared less about them. I was into animals, and dinosaurs were nothing more than big, ugly, scary monsters. With that said, I was rather obsessed with birds at the time, so I guess I was in a dinosaur phase, albeit a rather unconventional one. However, that was soon to change. The 1999 documentary Walking with Dinosaurs and its various spin-offs presented the denizens of the ancient Earth in a manner that I had hitherto never seen. Gone were the ugly, grey monsters that ambled through swamps and desolate volcanic wastelands. I was watching animals with colours and patterns and character. Animals just living their lives on a rich, vibrant planet. Animals that were similar in so many ways to their counterparts that still walk under the sun today, and yet at the same time, so wildly different and so endlessly enthralling. Thus began my belated dinosaur phase. Of course, as we grow, steadily succumbing to the cacophony of daily life, our childhood passions wane, and many who spent their younger years completely obsessed with dinosaurs now hold them in a light that is hardly dissimilar to how I once saw them. My interest too faded as I grew, though it never fully ebbed away, rather it became dormant, just waiting for another catalyst, something that, like the Walking With series, would rekindle that childhood fascination, and give it the chance to rise and blossom once more. But paleo media, on the tail end of that golden age brought about by Walking With Dinosaurs, seemed to be taking a nosedive. Documentaries and blockbuster movies became indiscernible. Dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals were consistently portrayed as little more than Hollywood monsters, roaring, stomping, tearing at each other's throats. The simple concepts that made the Walking With series so great were abandoned, and it seemed the dinosaur phase that lay dormant in my mind as though it were a long-repressed memory would never get the chance to resurface. But life finds a way. From amidst the cesspool of documentaries that were painfully mediocre at best and nothing short of atrocious at worst, came Prehistoric Planet, something I could only describe as a love letter to all paleo enthusiasts. The moment the very first teasers were released, it was clear that this was going to be something special. While dinosaur media as a whole remained almost resolutely stuck in the 90s, clinging to outdated reconstructions for the sake of nostalgia or perhaps just looking cool, Prehistoric Planet aimed to bring the most up-to-date depictions of dinosaurs to the big screen, and it did so in stunning detail. In an instant, my long-repressed dinosaur phase broke free of its shackles. Not since the days that Walking With Dinosaurs held my 10-year-old self in near ceaseless obsession had my interest in prehistory been so keen. And who better to narrate such a groundbreaking documentary than Sir David Attenborough? Not only the voice of nature itself, but the brother of a starring actor in arguably the most revolutionary and iconic piece of dinosaur media ever made.
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
A second season of Prehistoric Planet was released a year later. There was another dinosaur documentary that aired between them, but let's not talk about that one. So now with that unnecessarily long and overwritten backstory out of the way, we'll get into the review. I'll be covering both seasons, and between them there is a lot to talk about. I'll say right now that this is not going to be an in-depth accuracy review. There are other channels with a much stronger focus on paleontology that discuss the show's accuracy far more thoroughly than I ever could. Instead, I'll be focusing primarily on Prehistoric Planet's merits as a documentary overall. Obviously, accuracy is an important aspect of a good documentary, and I'm still going to talk about it, but like I said, that won't be the principal subject of the review. There are some criticisms to be made, most if not all of which are nitpicks, but I'll leave those to the end. Let's start with the positives, and mark my words, there's a ton to say here. First of all, the visuals are breathtaking. I'm not even exaggerating when I say that nearly every frame is something worthy of a desktop wallpaper. The reconstructions of the animals are, in most cases, almost photorealistic, and even the weaker examples still stand head and shoulders above practically any of their competition in other dinosaur media. And for many of the species that appear in this documentary, their portrayals in Prehistoric Planet are, from a scientific accuracy standpoint, the best recreations ever put to screen. And many of the inaccuracies that plagued paleomedia for decades have finally been discarded. From an aesthetic standpoint too, the designs of the animals in the series are superb. Many other shows featuring dinosaurs tend to either make them excessively bland, basically an assortment of greys and browns, Australian tarantulas in a nutshell, or go to the other extreme with over-the-top vibrant coloration, especially in the case of feathered dinosaurs. Prehistoric Planet takes a much more balanced approach, carefully echoing the variation we see in animals today, where some animals possess vivid colours while others are dull, and some have intricate patterns whereas others are fairly plain. And in general, their appearances fit their respective habitats exceptionally well. The sounds too are near perfection. Gone are the mindless monsters that roar at the screen every 5 seconds. Instead, we're treated to a much more sparingly used and subtle suite of vocalizations. The only sound effect I wasn't especially keen on was the generic big cat roar made by a Tyrannosaurus when being harassed by a pair of Quetzalcoatlus. It's just a brief, one-off thing, but in a documentary that, by and large, handled the animals' vocalizations almost flawlessly, it kinda stuck out like a sore thumb. Another thing that the series does marvellously is the subversion of long-standing cliches in paleomedia. Among the most pervasive of these is the trope of presenting herbivores as gentle, lumbering pacifists, while carnivores are murderous psychopaths without an iota of self-preservation. And I'm sure anyone with even a meagre knowledge of our modern fauna would be fully aware that that isn't the most accurate representation of the animal kingdom. Carnivores can be relaxed and docile, and herbivores can be brutal. And this is exactly what Prehistoric Planet delivers. We see predators exhibiting benign behaviours, such as courting, taking care of their young, or just simply relaxing. And likewise, there's several scenes showing herbivores getting violent. Most notably the lethal battle between two male Dreadnoughtus, the only documentary sequence I've seen in which sauropods are presented as nothing short of menacing. Something that I must say is long overdue. It's about time we saw sauropods showcased as towering, multi-ton, immensely powerful behemoths, rather than slow, defenseless meatbags. There's other examples of cliches pertaining to particular animals or groups of animals being subverted in this way, namely the oviraptorid Corythoraptor being presented not as an egg thief, a recurring and flawed trend in oviraptorid depictions, but as an attentive parent and even a victim of egg thievery itself. But perhaps my favourite examples of persistent tropes being broken in this series don't concern any specific animals, but the state of the world and its life forms overall. First of all, the ending. I'm sure anyone who has watched their fair share of dinosaur documentaries will have noticed that they nearly all tend to
go out with a bang, so to speak.
I get that Chicxulub impact was a major turning point in evolutionary history, but at this point it's been massively overused, and it's honestly a huge breath of fresh air to see a documentary on dinosaurs that simply lives in the moment. Also, fond as I am of walking with dinosaurs, it lent very heavily into a narrative centered around death and extinction, and made it seem as though the dinosaurs and their contemporaries, such as pterosaurs and marine reptiles, had peaked in the Jurassic and were dwindling from there on out. And by the late Cretaceous period, the dinosaurs were made out to be a doomed lineage, barely clinging to existence. The Hell Creek Formation is misrepresented as this toxic volcanic wasteland, and the Chicxulub impact seems like a merciful end to an already dying empire. Perhaps due in a large part to the persistent rise and fall narrative in Walking with Dinosaurs, it's quite a widespread belief that the dinosaurs were already on their way out thanks to volcanic activity, and that the asteroid impact was merely a coup de grace. This notion, however, has always been rather dubious to my knowledge, and it seems much more likely that the dinosaurs were thriving right to the end. And this is the perspective that Prehistoric Planet provides. Specifically, Hell Creek is finally given its due, accurately reconstructed as a lush ecosystem full of life. And almost as a direct counter to the erroneous idea of volcanic eruptions driving dinosaurs into decline, they are shown actively seeking out areas of high volcanic activity in order to incubate their eggs, a behaviour that is quite robustly based off fossil evidence as explained in one of the uncovered segments. In my last documentary review concerning monster bug wars, I stated that one of the biggest praises I could give for the show was that it shone a spotlight on a wide variety of otherwise little known and overlooked animals. And I'd say the same for Prehistoric Planet. An issue that seems to run rampant in documentaries, not only paleo documentaries but ones focused on modern wildlife too, is a tendency to direct an overwhelming amount of attention towards well-known charismatic animals. In present-day nature documentaries, that includes things like lions, elephants, and gorillas. And in documentaries about prehistoric life, iconic dinosaurs like Triceratops, Velociraptor, and of course Tyrannosaurus rex tend to hog the limelight. Of course, including the most infamous species, be they living or extinct, is an excellent way to garner viewership, especially from a more casual audience who may not be overly excited by the prospect of seeing Diplomacerus or Baculites on the big screen. However, this tendency for documentaries to focus heavily on the big names means that an enormous variety of lesser-known taxa get overlooked. Not only does this lead to an endlessly fascinating array of species going completely under the radar, but it also gets very repetitive after a while. T-Rex is cool and all, but given the incredible biodiversity of Earth's ecosystems throughout history, seeing the same small selection of familiar species ad nauseum does eventually get stale. And this is where Prehistoric Planet stands out, more so than practically any other paleo documentary to date. Prehistoric Planet showcases not just the most iconic dinosaurs, but the weird and wonderful creatures that lived alongside them. Take, for example, the ammonites. Ammonites are cephalopods like squid and octopuses. Though they may closely resemble the modern nautilus, they are not especially close relatives. In fact, the nautilus belongs to a lineage even more ancient than the ammonites. Ammonites were an incredibly successful group of animals, and by the late Cretaceous period, which is when the entirety of both seasons of Prehistoric Planet are set, they had reached a mind-boggling level of diversity. Yet in spite of this, in paleo media they are often relegated to being little more than part of the background ambience, or at most something for marine reptiles to feed on. Prehistoric Planet, however, gives this fascinating group of animals some long overdue recognition, and showcases their kaleidoscopic variety in a way that no paleo media I'm aware of had ever done before. Another group of animals that are often undersold in paleo media but absolutely stole the show in Prehistoric Planet are the pterosaurs. Pterosaurs are a strange case when it comes to representation in media, and the public's knowledge about them in general. Most people, I dare say, know about them to some extent, if only by the generic umbrella term pterodactyl, or even worse, flying dinosaur, which of course they aren't. And it's not like pterosaurs haven't been featured rather regularly in dinosaur-related movies and documentaries. They're certainly not nearly as obscure as the ammonites. But even so, they suffer from the same treatment. A tendency to be reduced to part of the ambience instead of getting their own place in the spotlight, and a general lack of attention paid to just how marvellously varied and utterly bizarre they were. Even during the peak of my childhood obsession with prehistory, I can't say I particularly cared for pterosaurs. I'd nearly always skip over them when reading dinosaur books. Now, however, they have well and truly cemented their place as one of my favourite groups of extinct animals. In Prehistoric Planet, not only are a plethora of different pterosaur species featured, many of them star in their own unique and memorable sequences, including creative but grounded speculation like satellite male Barbarodactylus, and a complex courtship display between a Hatzegopteryx pair, as well as hunting scenes, nesting, and intraspecific combat. This is, by far, the most multifaceted portrayal of pterosaurs in any documentary, and it's not just the variety displayed either. Every bit as pertinent to my praise of Prehistoric Planet's unrivaled depiction of pterosaurs is their accuracy. They are adorned with a fluffy coat of pycnofibers, their wings fold backwards instead of sideways, and perhaps most importantly, their competence on the ground is made very apparent. In most paleo media, pterosaurs on the ground get the fish out of water treatment, and walk around like drunken partygoers on a Saturday night. This is in contrast to more updated information about these animals, which suggests that they were not only masters of the air, but very proficient at terrestrial locomotion as well. If I were to sum up everything Prehistoric Planet did right with pterosaurs, using only a single species as an example, that species would have to be the horror of Hatzeg Island, Hatzegopteryx thambema. A member of the most formidable family of pterosaurs, the Astarchids, Hatzegopteryx was unique in that it is the only pterosaur known to have likely been an apex predator in its ecosystem, possessing numerous adaptations for subduing large prey, such as a relatively robust neck and a broader, more powerful beak. It first appears at the end of the final episode of Season 1, ambushing a baby's almoxes. Its appearance was brief and, if anything, a little underwhelming. but it nevertheless made for a beautiful close to the episode, and the season as a whole, as it soared off gracefully into the sunset. Hatzegopteryx reappeared in the first episode of Season 2, focused on islands, this time dominating the show with one of the most brilliant hunting sequences in any paleo documentary, and one that instantly quelled my mild disappointment with the species' very short feature in Season 1. We see these monumental terrors of the air descend upon a herd of Tethys hadros and start running them down, their effectiveness at terrestrial locomotion in full display. Hatzegopteryx returns at the end of the episode, this time for a much more tranquil scene. A male, bearing vibrant nuptial colours, engages in courtship with a female, against the picturesque backdrop of a small coral cay. The way Prehistoric Planet presents Hatzegopteryx exemplifies one of the series' greatest strengths: its balanced, multifaceted portrayals of prehistoric life. Hatzegopteryx is shown to be a majestic master of the skies, a terrifying predator, and, finally, a behaviourally complex animal that, like all of the most fearsome hunters, has a softer, more tender side. Pterosaurs and ammonites are perhaps the two most recurring examples of relatively obscure animals being given some long overdue recognition, but they're far from the only ones. The primitive mammal Adalatherium, the giant frog Beelzebufo, and the bizarre plant-eating crocodilomorph Simosuchus are just some of the dinosaurs' lesser-known contemporaries that, through their magnificent depictions in Prehistoric Planet, have been thrust into the public eye. And then there's the dinosaurs themselves. Alongside the more familiar species are incredibly unique taxa like Deinocheirus, Ostroraptor and Mononicus that, in spite of being every bit as fascinating as their more famous relatives, had garnered little to no recognition prior to their appearances in this series. But drawing attention to obscure species is far from the only thing Prehistoric Planet excels at. Just as exceptional is its proclivity for presenting familiar species in novel ways. And if we're going to talk about well-known prehistoric animals, then where else to start than with Tyrannosaurus rex. Arguably the most iconic of all dinosaurs, T-Rex has been a staple in paleomedia since the very beginning. And it's not hard to see why. An imposing and very memorable name, a status as possibly the largest and most powerful terrestrial carnivore of all time, and the fact that with every new study the species just seems to get more and more formidable, all contribute to its near-celebrity status among dinosaurs. In short, T-Rex is awesome. But at the same time, I won't pretend that it can't get a little dull to see this one animal getting featured in media over and over and over again. And it doesn't help that its behaviour is often extremely repetitive too. It stomps, it roars, it kills things. Yeah, we get it. Can we see something else now? Prehistoric Planet's depiction of T-Rex is, in my opinion, one of its standout achievements. First of all, the design is incredible, both from an aesthetic and scientific standpoint, not to mention its originality. Finally, we have a T-Rex that isn't just a knockoff of the one from Jurassic Park. But every bit as commendable as the dinosaur's physical appearance in the series is the way that it is used. Between the two seasons, T-Rex appears in 4 scenes in 4 separate episodes, and each scene brings something new to the table. Season 1 seemed to place more emphasis on the animal's softer side. We see an adult male taking his youngsters for a swim, braving the perils of the ocean along the way, and in a subsequent episode, a tender mating ritual between 2 of these colossal predators. Portraying the more mundane aspects of T-Rex's life was doubtless a brilliant decision, and a major reason why Prehistoric Planet's depiction of the species has done an unrivaled job at presenting T-Rex as animal first, monster second. Nevertheless, some viewers were understandably disappointed that we never really got to see this legendary predator in action. Earlier in this review, I said hunting scenes are overdone in paleo media, and I do stand by that statement. But good hunting scenes are another story, and much as I commend Season 1 for showing T-Rex doing something aside from just killing other dinosaurs, I couldn't help but agree with those who wished to see a proper depiction of the animal doing what it's best known for, being the greatest land predator of its time. A concern that was soon to be remedied in Season 2. Here we're treated with what is, by a landslide, the best depiction of Tyrannosaurus hunting in any media, and one that does the animal justice in ways that every other iteration of a T-Rex hunt failed to do. There's no mindless killing machine here, no stomping, no roaring, just two intelligent, terrifyingly competent predators stalking through the night, guided by their acute sense of smell and superb vision. And once the kill has been made, that's it. There's no dramatic, triumphant bellowing at the sky. There's nothing but the eerie silence of the night, as one of the greatest predators to ever live reaps the rewards of its hunt. The final scene T-Rex appears in is, again, different, and also perhaps the most controversial sequence in the entire series. It begins in a fairly unremarkable way. T-Rex arrives at an Alamosaurus carcass, scares off a trio of troodontids, and settles down to feed. But things start taking a turn towards chaos when a pair of the giant pterosaur Quetzalcoatlus arrive and, after a brief skirmish, drive the dinosaur away from its meal. This scene seems to have brought out the pitchforks more than any other sequence in the entire show. If you want to see what I mean, just take a look at the comment section on any clips of this confrontation. And at first it doesn't seem especially plausible. Two relatively lightweight pterosaurs somehow managing to deter arguably the biggest terrestrial predator of all time. I'll say myself that I'm not a big fan of how paleo media, especially the Jurassic franchise, tends to turn T-Rex into some sort of punching bag as a cheap, uncreative way to hype up whatever new big carnivore is being featured. But honestly, especially upon paying close attention to both parties' mannerisms throughout the duration of the conflict, the T-Rex vs Quetzalcoatlus sequence is actually extremely well done. When the first Quetzalcoatlus arrives, it's visibly very hesitant about getting too close. It advances a few steps, but when its opponent shows no signs of backing down, the pterosaur doesn't seem to be willing to try its luck any further, and the T-Rex appears to dismiss it as not worth the attention, turning around to resume its feasting. It's only when the second Quetzalcoatlus arrives that the pterosaurs go on the offensive, and even then it's not really a fight per se. Instead, they make use of their considerable mobility advantage to essentially harass T-Rex into submission. It's a balanced confrontation that manages to simultaneously demonstrate how formidable as darkened pterosaurs could have been, again drawing back to what I said earlier about Prehistoric Planet being the only media thus far to have done pterosaurs justice, and presenting Tyrannosaurus as a risk-averse animal willing to withdraw from a fight if it becomes more trouble than it's worth, while at the same time not making it out to be completely incompetent. In my opinion, it was a tremendous achievement by Prehistoric Planet to be able to feature T-Rex, an animal that is essentially a walking cliché, in a manner that felt fresh, unique, and original. And while T-Rex is, to me, the best example of the series managing to present well-known animals in novel, creative ways, it's far from the only one. Mosasaurs, while not quite as famous as the king of the tyrant lizards, are nonetheless a fairly familiar group to many. My opinion on mosasaurs is rather conflicted. On the one hand, I'm inclined to call them overrated, as their most famous portrayal in media, the Godzilla-sized monstrosity in Jurassic World, has given many people the impression that they were absolutely unfathomably colossal animals. Basically this generation's Liopleurodon. I will never forgive Walking with Dinosaurs setting me up for that disappointment. On the other hand, I find mosasaurs to be incredibly underrated, as the full extent of their diversity is often largely overlooked, with only the eponymous genus Mosasaurus getting significant recognition in popular culture. And in practically every one of its media appearances, it suffers from the same lack of originality as T-Rex, in that all it ever does is kill things. Prehistoric Planet shakes things up a little. First in terms of the variety of species featured. We have Mosasaurus itself, the quintessential giant apex predator, still presented as an absolute force to be reckoned with, while being much more reasonably sized than its Jurassic World counterpart. But on the other end of the spectrum, there's Phospherosaurus, a much smaller species that is, dare I say, cute. And then there's Caecaphylu and Globidens sitting somewhere in the middle. All in all, a great choice of species to show just how varied mosasaurs were, and the first time the latter three had ever been featured in a documentary. Then of course there's the way they're shown behaving. Prehistoric Planet has done a consistently commendable job at presenting a more balanced perspective of ancient life that closer parallels the animals we see today, and the mosasaurs are no exception. In particular, there's this beautifully tranquil scene in which a huge male mosasaurus relaxes on a coral reef, while various fish pick away at his shedding skin. A scene that echoes the numerous modern instances of large marine animals allowing themselves to be cleaned in a similar way by small fish and shrimp, and is actually very plausible given mosasaurs, unlike dinosaurs, which are often likened to lizards in spite of not being closely related at all, were literally giant lizards, and of course, all lizards periodically shed their skins. Granted, most other scenes in which mosasaurs appear do pertain to hunting. However, even then, each one unfolds in a unique way and doesn't really seem stale or repetitive in the slightest. The first can be seen as a more realistic take on the marine reptile versus big theropod trope that's fairly persistent in paleomedia, where instead of leaping out of the water in dramatic fashion to seize a full-sized theropod, the mosasaur instead cautiously tails a family of T-Rex before eventually snatching one of the defenseless babies. The later sequence, showing Caecaphylu attempting to hunt Tyrannosaurus, set the stage for yet another cliché subversion, with the plesiosaurs being presented as competent adversaries capable of defending themselves. The hunting scenes for Phospherosaurus and Globidens were both done in a way that showcased their specialised adaptations and how they could have been used. Phospherosaurus utilising its large eyes to hunt in low light levels, and Globidens crushing the shells of ammonites with its namesake blunt, rounded teeth. Finally, the Mosasaurus hunt demonstrated the immense acceleration the animal may have been capable of, as suggested by a study that was commissioned by the team behind the documentary. I also gotta say the series absolutely nailed the whole lizard aspect of mosasaurs. Their patterning, their facial features, and their somewhat frequent tongue flicking just scream lizard, and their affinity to modern monitor lizards and snakes is easy to see. If there is one issue I do have with how Prehistoric Planet portrayed mosasaurs, it's that Mosasaurus in particular is a little overhyped. It's stated to be more than twice the size of an adult Tyrannosaurus, which is something of an overestimate, albeit nowhere near as egregious as 25-metre Liopleurodon. And in one of the uncovered segments, mosasaurs are said to be arguably the greatest marine predators of all time, which is again a rather questionable claim, even with the wiggle room granted by the word arguably. Himalayasaurus tibetensis, an ichthyosaur from the Triassic period, also showed adaptations for raptorial predation, and would have dwarfed even the largest mosasaurs. Then of course there's the infamous giant shark Otodus megalodon, and its lesser known contemporary, the raptorial sperm whale Leviathan melvillei, both of which attained such immense sizes that, had they lived alongside mosasaurs, they'd not only be competing with them, but probably straight up preying on them. There's plenty more to be said in praise of Prehistoric Planet, but since I'd rather viewers of this video not feel like they're watching the Lord of the Rings extended editions, I'll start moving on now. Like I said near the beginning, the series, while outstanding, is not perfect, and I've already presented a couple minor criticisms, and there's a little more to say in that regard. One pertains to the way certain animals are named. Throughout the series, it's fairly common to hear genus names being said in a slightly shortened manner, like Tarbosaur, or Alamosaur, or Rajasaur, as opposed to Tarbosaurus, Alamosaurus, and Rajasaurus, respectively. Names generally only get shortened in such a manner when referring to higher classifications above genus level, and in several other instances, shortened names were used appropriately. Tyrannosaur can refer to the family Tyrannosauridae, and Mosasaur can refer to the superfamily Mosasauroidea. But there's no such thing as a Tarbosaur or a Rajasaur. Tarbosaurus is a Tyrannosaur, and Rajasaurus is an Abelisaur. Another naming-related issue that stuck out to me was the couple instances in which Zephactinus was called the X-fish. It's such a strange, informal name that feels rather out of place in a documentary. It'd be like calling T-Rex Rexy or Triceratops Trike. And above all, it just seems unnecessary. Why not simply use the proper name throughout, just like what was done for every other species that appeared in the show? Then there's the speculation. Well, not so much the speculation in itself, I thought that was great, rather the way it is sometimes communicated. The animals featured in the series exhibit a range of behaviours. Some are directly based off fossil evidence, such as plesiosaurs swallowing gizzard stones, or the ankylosaur Anodontosaurus consuming charcoal, which was found preserved in the stomach of a related species. Others can be robustly inferred based off the animal's morphology, such as Morturneria using its bizarre teeth to sieve for small benthic organisms buried in the sediment. And then there's behaviours that are pretty much entirely conjecture, but are exhibited by modern animals and thus within the realm of possibility, such as Triceratops journeying into a cave to feed on clay. I have no qualms with any of the above. However, from the perspective of a viewer, particularly someone who may not have much of a base knowledge on paleontology, it can be difficult or even impossible to determine how speculative a certain scene may be based solely off the narration. As an example, let's revisit the Mosasaurus cleaning scene. Here it is stated that mosasaurs are giant lizards, and have a lizard's forked tongue, and, during the mating season, a lizard's colourful skin. Now that first statement is not speculation at all. It's simply taxonomy. Saying mosasaurs are lizards is no more speculative than saying T-Rex is a dinosaur. The second statement, while less concrete and not based on direct fossil evidence, is still robustly supported through phylogenetic bracketing, in that most if not all of the mosasaurs' closest living relatives, such as varanoids and snakes, possess forked tongues. The third is merely a bit of fun speculation. Males of many modern lizard species do develop bright colours during the breeding season, though it's far from ubiquitous, and there's nothing that directly indicates nuptial coloration in mosasaurs, but it's within the realm of possibility. So essentially we have three statements of differing levels of certainty, being presented together with the same conviction. There's no way you'd be able to judge which claims are more or less speculative going off the narration alone. That being said, I feel the above issue is somewhat rectified by the fact that Prehistoric Planet is easily capable of instilling enough curiosity in a viewer for them to start, and I'd rather not use this phrase lest I sound like one of those people, doing their own research on any species or behaviours that interest them. I don't really have much more to say in terms of my own minor gripes with the series, but before we wrap up, I'd like to discuss some common criticisms directed toward the show that I don't personally agree with. Perhaps the most common concern I see directed at Prehistoric Planet is the lack of a cohesive narrative. And here the series is almost constantly compared to Walking with Dinosaurs, which has a much stronger focus on storytelling. Ever since the first teasers for Prehistoric Planet were released, it seemed many people were expecting it to be essentially a Walking with Dinosaurs reboot with updated science and visuals. Instead, what we got was something that, subject matter aside, is much more comparable to documentaries like Planet Earth than it is to the Walking With series, with each episode centered around a particular biome and featuring numerous snapshots of various animals from around the world. It was also set entirely at the very end of the Cretaceous, rather than moving forward through different time periods as is the norm for paleo documentaries. This difference in overall structure appears to have been a source of disappointment for many, to the point where I've rather regularly come across claims that Prehistoric Planet failed to live up to Walking with Dinosaurs. And this is a point of view that I've personally always found a tad confusing. Prehistoric Planet was, quite clearly, something that was never intended to be a Walking With successor. Even the name of the documentary itself makes it pretty clear that the show was styled in a manner more akin to Planet Earth. Not to mention that one of the opening lines in the beginning of every single episode of Season 1 was "Planet Earth, 66 million years ago." Like, how much more obvious could it possibly get that that's the style the show was going for? And then there's the fact that Prehistoric Planet's format, while certainly a novel approach for paleo documentaries, has pretty much been a staple amongst nature documentaries, particularly those presented by David Attenborough, for decades. The Living Planet, which came out in 1984, has an extremely similar structure to Prehistoric Planet, consisting of fairly short sequences of various animals and other organisms from all over the world, with no overarching narrative. And nor is one needed. The same can be said for many of the other installments in the Life series, as well as, of course, Planet Earth, Blue Planet, and their respective sequels. I would also venture to say that, for educational purposes, Prehistoric Planet's structure works considerably better than the more story-driven format of the Walking With series. In Walking with Dinosaurs, every episode would take place in a single location and focus on one or maybe a couple individual animals, which we would then follow for the duration of the episode, occasionally cutting over to other species along the way. The natural result of this, of course, is a couple focal species dominating the spotlight in each episode, while everything else gets pushed to the side. Additionally, the fact that Walking with Dinosaurs also jumps forward in time between each sequence means that we don't really get much of a taste of how biodiverse the planet was at any particular time period. Prehistoric Planet, by focusing on a set point in Earth's history and jumping all over the world to showcase a wide variety of animals in a similar manner to documentaries about contemporary fauna, paints a much more complete picture of how rich and lively the ancient Earth was. There are even instances where I'd say that the heavy focus on storytelling in Walking with Dinosaurs actively impeded its value as an educational piece. One that I've already touched on, the egregious misrepresentation of the Hell Creek Formation in order to fit the rise and fall narrative the show was espousing. Not only is the ecosystem as a whole absolutely butchered, but some of the animals, notably Quetzalcoatlus and Tyrannosaurus, are presented as these sickly, almost pitiable creatures. Like, sure, this works great from a storytelling perspective, and the show certainly succeeded at making the audience feel sorry for the animals, which I presume is what they were going for. But it's a massive dent in the overall merit of Walking with Dinosaurs as supposedly educational media. The same can be seen in the show's first episode with the crocodilian relative Postosuchus, the ecosystem's apex predator, being horribly portrayed as this lumbering, borderline incompetent hunter that was outright inferior to the then recently evolved dinosaurs in every way. Again, while it is true that presenting the dinosaurs' conquest of the planet as something inevitable and a result of their supposedly inherent superiority over the dominant megafauna at the time works well from a narrative standpoint, for a documentary, something that is, above all, meant to be educational, it seems to me to be a considerable misjudgment of priority. And Prehistoric Planet, lacking this need for every episode to tie into some grand, overarching, dramatic narrative, is free from these glaring flaws. Sure, some animals are shown hunting one another or fighting one another, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, but no species or clades are ever made out to be inherently superior or inferior. The other complaint I often see directed towards Prehistoric Planet is that it is apparently too soft, supposedly shying away from the brutality of nature. To an extent, I can kind of see where this is coming from. There are some instances of gore being censored by environmental features, and the documentary is overall much more light-hearted and whimsical when compared to other dinosaur-related media. But at the same time, I think it's quite a stretch to say that it paints a soft, rosy picture of nature. After all, if there's one thing that's been so constant throughout the entire series that it's become something of a meme, it's adorable baby animals getting brutally killed. Like, seriously, Prehistoric Planet has so much child predation that it could give the Catholic Church a run for its money. Part of me thinks that the complaints about Prehistoric Planet being too soft or PG ultimately stem from the major disparity in overall tone between documentaries about living wildlife versus those about prehistoric wildlife. Typical nature documentaries about modern animals quite often focus on showcasing the beauty of nature, displaying an abundance of cute, endearing, and downright comical behaviours. Dinosaur documentaries, on the other hand, tend to be excessively violent, with a near constant fixation on hunting and combat, and even those that aren't, like Walking with Dinosaurs, still tend to have a very sombre tone, with death and extinction being major themes. At the end of the day, Prehistoric Planet feels just like a typical David Attenborough documentary, and that I think is one of its greatest appeals. For once, it's not an epic display of monstrous, primal beasts buried by time. It's not about how the dinosaurs died, but how they lived. A celebration of their awe, their diversity, and their success. A success story that did not cease 66 million years ago, for the dinosaurs left behind more than just their crumbling, weathered skeletons. They bestowed upon the modern world another legacy, one that is rich, vibrant, and very much alive. Dinosaurs remain the most diverse and widespread of all terrestrial vertebrates. Through their vivid colours and melodic calls, they are a source of so much of nature's beauty. Chances are the very first animal you hear when you wake up Perhaps before you even open your eyes will be a dinosaur. When you step outside and breathe in the fresh morning air, there's a strong possibility the first animal you see will be a dinosaur. For, irrespective of where you are, an exotic, remote jungle, a bustling city square, or your own backyard, a quick glance at the sky will remind you that we are very much surrounded by the marvelous living legacy of our prehistoric planet.